Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea prepares to host a global summit on climate change, the P4G Summit. It's the first time Seoul's hosted a multilateral meeting on this issue, and President Moon Jae-in will be attending. South Korea announces that it'll take reservations from the general public to get any potential leftover doses of the coronavirus vaccines to make sure they don't go to waste. We've got the details on how to sign up. And with South Korean companies pledging tens of billions of dollars of investment in the U.S., the question is which states will benefit. A lot of signs point to Texas. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. Later this week, President Moon Jae-in will be attending the summit known as Partnering for Green Growth and Global Goals, or P4G for short. That's being held in Seoul. The Blue House says it'll be an opportunity for South Korea to establish a greater foothold as a leading country for climate action. Ahead of the summit, Moon will hold a virtual meeting with his counterpart from Denmark. Denmark was the host of the first P4G Summit in 2018. Kim Min-ji reports.
President Moon Jae-in will be taking part in the upcoming P4G Summit, or Partnering for Green Growth and Global Goals 2030. The two-day virtual event from May 30th will be held under the theme of inclusive green recovery toward carbon neutrality.
Since President Moon's inauguration, South Korea has been establishing a foothold as a leading country in tackling climate change for carbon neutrality and a sustainable society. We expect that through the P4G Summit, our companies will be able to secure competitiveness in the low-carbon green growth sector.
Some 60 heads of state and international organizations are expected to take part, including U.S. President Joe Biden. The Leaders' Dialogue, which Moon will chair, will be held Monday, and the summit will conclude with the adoption of the Seoul Declaration. This will be the first multilateral meeting related to the environment that South Korea has hosted. Seoul has been joining global efforts in response to climate change by unveiling its goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050 through its Green New Deal initiative. The top office expressed hope that the P4G Summit will serve as a stepping stone for the success of the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow in November. In October, ahead of that meeting, South Korea is expected to unveil its enhanced carbon reduction goal, known as the Nationally Determined Contribution, which currently stands at 24.4% reduction from 2017 levels. Ahead of the P4G Summit, President Moon will also hold a virtual bilateral summit with Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. Denmark was the host of the first P4G Summit in 2018. The two leaders are expected to discuss ways to cooperate for a successful P4G, as well as share views on ways to elevate their decade-old strategic partnership. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
South Korea today reported 516 new cases of COVID-19. This is the third straight day the daily number has been under 600. Of Tuesday's tally, 40% of the cases were outside the greater Seoul area. The health authorities have confirmed 4 so-called breakthrough infections in which people test positive even after being fully vaccinated. 2 of them reportedly caught the virus 2 weeks after getting their second shots and are asymptomatic. Of the 1,700 South Korean nationals who were flown back from India this month, 3% have tested positive. 10 of them had the Indian variant. South Korea has announced new measures to make sure that vaccines don't go to waste. From this Thursday, when vaccinations start for the general public, people will be able to sign up to get the doses that are left over. Jang Tae-hyun explains who's eligible and how to make a reservation.
With South Korea ramping up its vaccination program, people will soon be able to reserve and receive a leftover vaccine on the very same day, a vaccine which was reserved for someone else but they didn't show up.
Starting from this Thursday, we will check the medical facilities which have leftover AstraZeneva vaccines and give them to people on the same day. Reservation can be made through the Naver and Kakao mobile phone applications.
Starting at 1 p.m. on Thursday, medical facilities with leftover vaccines will upload the necessary information to the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency's vaccination system. Those wishing to get a leftover vaccine can search which inoculation centers have some using Naver or Kakao. Then after choosing a preferred medical facility, a reservation can be made. It's also possible to receive notifications from up to 5 local medical centers when vaccines become available. But the vaccines are not available to anyone who has already had their first shot or if they're under the age of 30. And anyone who doesn't show up without canceling in advance will not be allowed to receive a surplus vaccine. The second shot will be administered at the same medical facility 11 weeks after the first. After a 2-week trial period, the program will officially start on June 9th. In the meantime, 55,000 doses of the Moderna vaccine will arrive in the country by the end of the month and will be available for use starting in mid-June. The KDCA's Commissioner Jung Eun-kyung says that the nation's regular vaccine sign-up response has been good. On some days this month, as many as 300,000 to 400,000 people have been reserving their shots. Chang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
In last week's summit between the leaders of South Korea and the U.S., the two sides agreed to do more together to address shortages of coronavirus vaccines. President Biden committed to vaccinating all of South Korea's military personnel. Our Kim Do-yeon has the latest on the two sides' vaccine cooperation.
At the South Korea-U.S. summit last weekend, U.S. President Joe Biden made a surprise announcement.
There are 550,000 Korean soldiers, sailors, airmen who work in close contact with American forces in Korea. We'll provide full vaccinations for all 550,000 of those Korean forces engaging with American forces on a regular basis, both for their sake as well as the sake of the American forces.
On Tuesday, the South Korean health minister said the U.S. will share its plan for supplying the doses next week, showing that the vaccine partnership between the two are starting to yield results. Also, by early June, the two countries will launch the CORS Global Vaccine Partnership Experts Group. The group will be made up of scientists, experts, and officials from both sides who will work toward ending the pandemic as soon as possible and preparing for the next global health threat.
The establishment of the Korea-U.S. Global Vaccine Partnership means the alliance between the two countries goes beyond just security, and by advancing into vaccine alliance, the two will jointly respond to global health crises.
Companies from the two sides also signed several MOUs. These deals will enable South Korean companies to produce vaccines developed by the U.S. Also, South Korean government agencies signed deals with Novavax and Moderna to facilitate new investment in vaccine development and production.
The MOUs between the government and these companies will enable the outsourcing of mRNA vaccine production to Korea, and they will accelerate cooperation investments for mRNA vaccine production. We have also laid the foundation for research cooperation to respond to future infectious diseases, including COVID-19 variants.
The minister added that the summit also laid the foundation for South Korea to become a global vaccine hub, and that the government will do its best to help end the global pandemic by faithfully implementing follow-up measures and to increase the global reputation of Korea's bio industry. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
South Korea's foreign minister says that the reason there was no mention of human rights issues in China in the statement that came out of last week's summit in Washington is because of what he referred to as a special relationship between South Korea and China. Yoon Jung-min reports.
Regarding the South Korea-U.S. leaders' joint statement, Seoul's foreign minister says there was no mention of China's human rights issues because of South Korea's special relationship with China. Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong was speaking at Tuesday's virtual joint government briefing on President Moon Jae-in's working visit to the U.S.
Our government has been refraining from mentioning in detail internal issues in China in light of a special relationship between South Korea and China. This stance has been reflected in the joint statement.
The joint statement also included stability in the Taiwan Strait, which Chung said is a concern of all countries in the region for regional peace. Earlier, China had criticized the statement for mentioning the Taiwan issue, saying it will not tolerate any external interference on its internal affairs. South Korea's trade minister said at the joint briefing that Seoul will continue to expand its economic ties with Beijing, adding the economic issues discussed at the summit do not exclude any specific country. On Tuesday, the Blue House policy chief said in a radio interview that he does not see China retaliating economically again following the Seoul-Washington summit. China launched an economic retaliation a few years ago to protest against South Korea's decision to deploy a U.S. anti-missile defense system known as THAAD. Regarding the statement mentioning the human rights issue in North Korea, deemed by the regime to be a sensitive issue, the ministers at Seoul and Washington were trying to focus on improving the human rights situation in the North. He added they also agreed on the term denuclearization of the Korean peninsula in the statement instead of North Korea. Some have been saying that the terminology matters in that it may or may not leave room for the U.S. keeping South Korea under its nuclear umbrella. Chung added he sees no big difference between terminology used by the two Koreas. Chung said he expects North Korea-U.S. talks to resume soon, adding the summit has built momentum for the Korean peace process. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
The first face-to-face summit between the current leaders of South Korea and the U.S. led to a number of tangible outcomes, including a further bolstering of economic cooperation. There'll be close to $40 billion of investments by Korean companies in America, but the question is which states that money will go to, and there's a good chance it'll be Texas. Seo In-kyung has this report.
The best trip, the best summit, and never before seen outcomes. This is how South Korea's President Moon Jae-in and Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum described the summit with the United States. South Korean ministers held a briefing session on Tuesday to share the results of the summit and discuss follow-up measures. Trade Minister Moon Sung-wook said that the summit has allowed Korea and the U.S. to draw tangible achievements in the economic field, including the supply chain for key industries such as semiconductors.
At the Business Roundtable on May 21st, the two countries reached consensus over the need for cooperation in achieving a stable supply chain in core industries, and both governments have decided to proactively support the investment and cooperation of relevant companies regarding the matter.
With South Korea's major conglomerates unveiling their $39 billion of investment plans in the U.S. during the summit, eyes are on which state will receive Samsung's investment. During a business roundtable the day before the summit, Samsung Electronics Vice Chairman Kim Ki-nam said the company was planning to invest $17 billion and build a foundry plant in the U.S. That figure accounts for the largest share of the investment pledged by Korean companies. Many in the semiconductor industries are predicting that Samsung Electronics will build an additional factory in Austin, Texas, where the company already operates the foundry plant. Since 1998, Samsung Electronics' Austin branch in Texas have been mainly producing power semiconductor products for IT devices and other semiconductors for communication devices. The company also purchased additional land near the factory at the end of last year. In a letter of investment intent submitted to the Texas government, Samsung expected that the additional construction of a foundry plant would bring an economic effect of near $9 billion to the local economy and create around 20,000 jobs. Samsung Electronics has declined to take an official stance on the issue, saying that currently investment areas in the U.S. are being reviewed and have not been decided yet. Seo In-kyung, Arirang News.
As India struggles to contain the coronavirus, Hyundai Motor is shutting down its factory there for the next 5 days. Known as the auto hub of India, the state of Tamil Nadu is one of the areas that's been hit hardest, with more than 30,000 new cases a day last week. A lockdown is in force there until May 31st, but Hyundai Motor was one of a handful of factories to be granted an exemption. Hyundai made the call to shut down Monday when workers staged a sit-in protest after 2 of their fellow employees contracted the virus. South Korea's consumer sentiment was up last month for a 5th month in a row, to a high not seen since mid-2018. Data from the Bank of Korea show that the composite consumer sentiment index was up in May by 3 points to 105.2. A reading above 100 indicates that more people are optimistic than pessimistic about the economy. The Bank of Korea said this reflects hope that the economic recovery will continue thanks to surprise GDP growth in the first quarter, robust exports, vaccine rollouts, and better jobs numbers. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good to have you back on. Thank you for making time today.
Good afternoon.
Well, let's start at the Fed and some issues that touch on the cryptocurrency space. Of course, that's been seeing extreme volatility in the last week, but a few things to think about. Fed Governor Lael Brainerd again saying the U.S. needs to go for a digital dollar. And she also spoke about inflation, saying that the current spike in prices is likely to be temporary. Tell us about her remarks and what you see happening in the markets.
Yes, Lael Brainerd, member of the Fed governors, said that there'll be clear case for a secure central bank-backed digital currency that could create a more efficient payment system and expand the financial services to Americans who have been underserved by traditional banks. Clearly, this comment's coming right after the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, announced that the central bank would publish a paper this summer laying out the board's thinking on the benefits and risks associated with a digital U.S. dollars. Now, as you know, overall cryptocurrency market size has increased and blossomed to as high as $2.5 trillion. Now has declined somewhat to about $1.5 trillion with the recent corrections. We don't think that the central banks, including Fed, will be allowing the cryptocurrency to take over the current dollars or any central banks-backed currencies. If that happens, then obviously you don't need central bank and you don't need government. So clearly there will be continuation of regulatory environment that tackles down the cryptocurrencies. However, though, the digital currency is very important in order to maximize the current changes that we are seeing in the Internet on Thing and all the digitalizations of the goods and services that we are actually providing and having. So we think that the digital currency market will continue to flourish in the future. It's just that it will be needed from the government back or government centralizations rather than decentralized cryptocurrencies. Overall, right now, the cryptocurrency market has, as I said, increased as high as $2.5 trillion, now declined to $1.5 trillion. And obviously, this will substitute some value of gold, which we have seen total size to be about $11 trillion worth. We don't think that the cryptocurrency is going to substitute any overall currency market, but just the so-called alternative assets such as gold.
Right, and the Bank of Korea said it's going to start looking at proposals for a digital currency later this year as well. But now, not only crypto, but stocks on Wall Street saw a bounce back overnight. The gain on the Nasdaq bigger, as was its recent loss. But the Nasdaq up about 1.4%, the S&P about 1%. What's behind these moves in the U.S. market?
Yes, on Monday, Dow Jones increased by 0.5%. S&P 500 gained almost 1%. And also Nasdaq was up 1.4%. We're clearly seeing some value coming back to buying the so-called tech stocks or the high growth stocks. We saw for the past 1 week or so, Nasdaq actually doing better than most of the other market. So far this year to date, Nasdaq has been one of the least performing out of all the indexes that we've seen. The reason for this is because we are seeing quite stable interest rate environment. If you look at 10-year government bond rate, it has actually declined to below 1.6%. And there have been continued concern about inflationary pressure and commodity price rise. However, we have seen in the last few weeks or so a commodity price stabilizing and oil prices stabilizing as well. And inflation numbers, everybody are now recognizing that the number that we saw in April was temporarily. And yes, there are inflation exist. However, though, we don't think that it's going to continue in a longer-term basis. If that's the case, the interest rate will stabilize, and that overall market will look very good as the economy recovers. A lot of people were talking about the earnings yield after inflation being negative, and that could be a sign for major correction. However, though, given the fact that right now we are still negative interest rate environment, including the inflation, which means that we're not in any close to market picking up anytime soon. We think that the earnings growth is ample, and that also liquidity is still ample as well, and inflation pressure is not going to be that significant in a longer-term basis.
Well, today Korean stocks had gains similar to those in the U.S. The Kospi back above 3150, the Kosdaq at about 960, a little above that. It looks like retail investors may be taking some profits. Tell us about the Korean market.
Right. After some correction yesterday, without any reasons, I guess, if you look at the Kospi has added about 0.86% for Kospi, and the Kosdaq was up about 1.44%. Most important thing is this. The Kospi is one of the most sensitive to economic recovery of global basis. If the global economy recovers, then high export-dependent Korea benefits significantly, and Korea being very cyclical, we are seeing a very strong earnings growth rate and economic recovery as well, and that should all pump into the equity market rise in the future. We think that the level of earnings growth that we're expected for Kospi to be well above 50% year on year. That is one of the strongest numbers that we have seen in the past decades. And also, if you look at the valuation-wise, it is trading at only 12 times PE versus S&P trading at 21 times. So clearly it's a deep discount with earnings growth that is higher than the U.S. market. And also U.S. dollar stabilizing or so-called somewhat of being a little bit depreciative that Korean want to appreciate in the future. That is positive news for foreign investors who are purchasing Korean equities. So therefore, net selling by the foreign investors should dwindle down, and also the fundamentals should support the Korean equity market to rise in the future.
Well, Mr. Yu, as we might expect now, data for May are showing a rebound in consumer confidence in Korea. People are feeling better about the economy overall. Tell us a bit about these numbers and what you make of them.
Yes, the composite consumer sentiment index is up to 105.2, which is significantly higher than 102.2 in the previous month. It was the fifth consecutive monthly gain and the highest since the June of 2018, with the household more optimistic about the current state of the economy. And also future domestic economic conditions, as well as the living standard and spending. These numbers are coming well because we are seeing very strong export growth rate. As I said before, Korea is highly dependent on export. And with that, further, I guess, benefit to the domestic consumption as well. Even though the Korea is highly leveraged in terms of the consumers, that the consumer debt as percent of GDP is well close to 100%. That is negative news. However, though, as long as interest rate remains at around 2% level, that which we're seeing right now, the burden to the household will not be that significant. In the past, when we saw U.S. actually having a crisis on consumer debt, that's even though it was similar to the level of the GDP right now, Korea, but it was at much higher interest rate environment of 4 to 5%. If the Korea interest rate rises to 4 to 5%, then that could be very negative news. But right now, the interest rate is quite loose. That U.S. is still at 1.6% for 10 years, Korea being at around 2.1%. We think that these sentiment indicators are actually fitting positively for Korean economy as well as Korean equity market.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.